It's December 1983. Washington, D.C., the Kennedy Center, one of the most prestigious music events in the entire country. The room is filled with senators, Supreme Court justices, classical music legends, people who have dedicated their entire lives to what they call real music. And then Michael Jackson walks in. Not performing, not there to moonwalk, just a guest. A man who had written a check to fund music education programs and earned himself a seat at the table. But one man in that room wasn't having it. Alejandro Virtuoso, 68 years old, one of the most decorated classical pianists alive, looked across the reception hall at Michael Jackson and felt something that can only be described as contempt. He'd performed at Carnegie Hall over 200 times. He'd recorded with the Vienna Philharmonic. He believed deeply and sincerely that pop music was not real music. And Michael Jackson, with his sequined glove and his Thriller album and his moonwalk, was the walking symbol of everything he thought was wrong with modern culture. So Virtuoso did something that night that he was absolutely convinced would expose Michael Jackson as a fraud in front of Washington's most powerful people. He challenged him publicly on stage in front of 2,000 people. He walked up to the microphone after his own flawless performance, looked directly at Michael, and essentially said, "Come up here and prove you're a musician." What happened next left the entire concert hall in silence. And then it left them on their feet. Because Michael Jackson had been hiding something, a secret he'd kept for over 15 years, something nobody in that room, nobody in the entire world knew about the king of pop. Stay with me, because this story is not what you think it is. Before we get into it, if you're new here, welcome. We cover stories like this all the time. Moments in music history that didn't make the headlines but absolutely should have. Hit subscribe so you don't miss them, and drop a comment right now telling me, did you have any idea Michael Jackson could play classical piano? Because I genuinely did not see this coming when I first came across this story. All right, let's go back to the beginning. To understand why that December night hit so hard, you have to understand the world Michael Jackson existed in by late 1983. Thriller had just been released the previous year. The album was doing something that no album had ever done before and arguably hasn't been matched since. It was selling 1 million copies a week. It would go on to become the best-selling album in recorded history. Michael Jackson wasn't just famous, he was operating at a level of fame that didn't have a comparison point. There was no template for what he was experiencing. But here's the thing about extreme fame that people don't always talk about. It comes with a very specific kind of loneliness. Because the bigger you get, the more people stop seeing you and start seeing the idea of you. And for Michael, the idea was very clear. Pop star, entertainer, dancer, the moonwalk guy, the guy with the glove, someone who makes catchy songs that people love to dance to. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But Michael knew there was more to him than that image, and the world wasn't particularly interested in looking deeper. The classical music world especially wasn't interested. See, in 1983, the divide between classical music and popular music wasn't just a matter of taste. It was almost a class distinction. Classical musicians had training, pedigree, history. Pop musicians had charts and choreography. The two worlds didn't mix, and people like Alejandro Virtuoso were perfectly happy keeping it that way. Virtuoso represented the absolute pinnacle of that world. The kind of musician who had spent decades in conservatories, who knew every nuance of Beethoven and Rachmaninoff and Chopin not just technically but historically and emotionally. He had context, he had depth, he had credentials that would fill a wall. When the Kennedy Center Honors Gala invited Michael Jackson because of his charitable contributions to music education, contributions that were genuinely massive, by the way, we're talking millions of dollars funding music programs in schools across the country, Virtuoso wasn't impressed. In his mind, writing a check didn't make you a musician. It made you a rich celebrity who wanted to seem cultured. So when Michael arrived at the reception that evening, aware of the sideways glances, aware of the whispered comments, aware that he was being viewed as an outsider who didn't belong, he kept his head down. He was used to skepticism. He'd faced it his whole career in different forms. The best strategy he'd learned was to not engage. Don't fight it. Don't argue. Just be in the room and let people figure out eventually that they were wrong about you. That plan worked fine, right up until Virtuoso got on the microphone. Virtuoso had just given what by all accounts was a masterful performance of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 backed by the National Symphony Orchestra. The audience gave him a standing ovation. He had earned it. His playing was technically flawless, emotionally rich, the kind of performance that reminds you why classical music has survived for centuries. But then, instead of taking his bow and walking off stage, he walked to the microphone. And the room quieted down, because when a man like Alejandro Virtuoso has something to say after a performance like that, you listen. He started talking about musical excellence, about dedication and rigor and artistic perfection. Beautiful words, things you'd nod along to, and then his eyes found Michael Jackson in the crowd and his tone shifted. "I see we have a celebrity in our midst tonight," he said. "Mr. Jackson, isn't it, from that pop group?" He said pop group the way someone might say something they'd stepped on. The room shifted. Everyone felt it. Some people were uncomfortable, some were curious. And Virtuoso, feeding off the attention, kept going. He framed it as a friendly question. He said he'd always been curious about popular musicians. All that spectacle, he said, all that entertainment value. But where was the musicianship? Where was the technical skill? And then, and this is the part that would have made my stomach drop if I were in that room, he gestured to the Steinway grand piano still sitting on the stage and essentially said, "Come show us what popular musicians consider musical skill." It was framed as an invitation. It was a trap. Think about what he was doing. He had just performed one of the most demanding pieces in the classical piano repertoire, with a full orchestra to rapturous applause. The bar he had just set was not a beginner's bar. And now he was inviting a pop star in front of 2,000 of Washington's most influential people to sit down at that same piano. If Michael declined, he was confirming everything Virtuoso implied, that he wasn't a real musician, that he didn't belong in that room on musical terms. If Michael accepted and struggled, which was exactly what Virtuoso expected, then the humiliation would be complete and public and unforgettable. Michael sat very still. His jaw was tight. He was processing the situation. And then something happened that Virtuoso definitely did not plan for. A young woman stood up in the balcony section. Her name was Sarah Kennedy, early 20s, auburn hair, a small pin on her black dress identifying her as a Juilliard student. She was there because students from top music conservatories were occasionally included in events like this, to witness, to absorb, to be inspired by the world they were training to enter. And she stood up in that balcony, and her voice cut clean through the tension of 2,000 silent people. "Maestro Virtuoso," she said, "what you're doing isn't about musical excellence, it's about prejudice." The room went electric. Here is a piano performance major at Juilliard, meaning she has spent her entire life immersed in the classical world. This man rules, publicly calling out one of its most revered figures. In his own house, in front of everyone he's ever impressed. She didn't back down. She said dismissing an artist's abilities based on genre was ignorant and small-minded. She pointed out that Michael Jackson had contributed more to music education in that country than most classical musicians ever would. And she said that maybe instead of questioning his credentials, they should be thanking him. Virtuoso turned red. He started to sputter a response. And Michael Jackson stood up. Not rushed, not dramatic. He stood up the way someone stands up when they've made a decision they're completely at peace with. He adjusted his jacket, and he started walking toward the stage. The room went absolutely silent. Here's what 2,000 people in the Kennedy Center did not know that night. Here's what the entire world did not know. Michael Jackson had been studying classical piano for 14 years. 14 years? It started in 1969. Michael was 11 years old and the Jackson 5 had just been signed to Motown Records. Berry Gordy ran a tight ship, and one of his requirements for his young artists was that they learn musical fundamentals. Not just vocal arrangements and choreography, actual musical theory. How to read music, how to understand what they were performing. While his brothers focused on the performance side of things, Michael spent extra hours at the piano with Motown's classically trained instructors. He learned to read sheet music. He studied basic composition, and somewhere in those sessions something clicked. He didn't just tolerate this part of his education, he fell in love with it. Diana Ross became a major mentor to young Michael during this period. She famously told him, "Learn the rules before you break them. Understand what the masters did, then find your own voice." And she went further than advice. She arranged for Michael to have private piano lessons with her own classical teacher during the Jackson Five's breaks from touring. So while his brothers were relaxing in hotel rooms between concerts, 11, 12, 13-year-old Michael Jackson was finding the nearest piano in whatever hotel lobby they were staying in and practicing Bach inventions. Chopin nocturnes, Beethoven sonatas. This wasn't career strategy. It wasn't about building an image or expanding his brand. Nobody knew about it. Motown's publicity machine was very clear that the Jackson 5 needed to project a certain image: young, fun, accessible, energetic. Classical piano did not fit that image. So Michael's studies stayed completely private, shared only with a handful of close mentors and teachers who were asked to keep it quiet. And here's what makes this remarkable. He kept those lessons going through the 1970s, through the Jackson 5 tour, through the transition to Off the Wall, through the building of the Thriller era. The whole time, quietly, privately, in hotel rooms and rehearsal spaces, and whatever corner of the world he happened to be in, Michael was practicing classical piano. By 1983, he had 14 years of dedicated classical training behind him. He'd reached a level of genuine proficiency, not pop musician who can fumble through a few bars proficiency. Actual, serious, classical pianist proficiency. The kind of level that takes years of daily practice to reach and more years to maintain. But he'd never performed classical music publicly, never mentioned it in interviews, never let it slip. Part of it was image management. He didn't want to seem pretentious or confuse his audience. But if you read between the lines of everything Michael said about music across his career, there's another reason he kept this to himself. It was his sanctuary. It was the one part of his musical life that belonged entirely to him, that wasn't packaged and sold and turned into spectacle. When he sat down at a piano and played Beethoven, he wasn't performing for anyone. He was just a musician, alone with music. And now, walking toward the stage of the Kennedy Center with 2,000 people watching, he was about to share that sanctuary with the world for the first time. Michael reached the piano and sat down on the bench with complete composure. He ran his fingers lightly across the keys first, not playing, just feeling. The way pianists do when they're getting to know an instrument, sensing its weight and touch and tone. That gesture alone told the musicians in the room something. That's not how someone sits down to bluff their way through a performance. That's how someone sits down who actually knows what they're doing. Virtuoso had stepped back from the microphone, suddenly a little less certain of himself. "Maestro," Michael said quietly, "you mentioned technical skill and understanding of musical tradition." He paused. "I'd like to perform Beethoven's Piano, Sonata No. 14 in C-sharp minor, third movement." He didn't need to say the subtitle. Everyone in that room knew it. The Moonlight Sonata. But here's the thing that's crucial to understand, and I want to make sure this lands. He didn't say the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata. The first movement is the one most people know. The slow, gentle, dreamy opening that gets played in movies and television shows. Even a moderately skilled pianist can get through the first movement. He said the third movement. The third movement of the Moonlight Sonata is one of the most technically demanding pieces in the entire classical piano repertoire. Beethoven himself was in the grip of some kind of creative storm when he wrote it. It's turbulent, relentless, ferociously difficult. The right hand plays rapid, cascading arpeggios at speeds that require absolute precision finger independence. The left hand drives forward with hammering chords that demand tremendous power and control. The dynamic range is extreme, from delicate passages that require the softest possible touch to thunderous sections that shake the room. Professional concert pianists work on the third movement for years. Some never feel they've truly mastered it. It's the piece you play when you want to prove, beyond any possible doubt, that you are a serious pianist. Michael Jackson chose it without hesitation. A murmur moved through the audience. The musicians in the room exchanged glances. Virtuoso went still. And then Michael began to play. The opening measures filled the Kennedy Center. And it was immediately, unmistakably, the real thing. His fingers moved across the keys with the fluidity that comes from thousands of hours of practice. The arpeggios that would trip up most players flowed from his hands with apparent ease. The dynamic contrasts, the sudden swells and retreats that give the piece its emotional power, were handled with sensitivity and intention. This wasn't someone struggling to remember the notes. This was someone who had played this piece so many times it lived in his hands. Virtuoso's face was doing something unusual. It was cycling through expressions in a way you rarely see on someone who has spent decades presenting an image of absolute authority. First, disbelief. This couldn't be real. Then confusion as his brain tried to reconcile what he was hearing with what he thought he knew. Then something softer and harder to name. The audience sat in silence so complete that the only sound in the Kennedy Center was Beethoven. 8 minutes of music. 8 minutes where Michael Jackson played one of the hardest pieces in classical repertoire from memory, with technical precision, with emotional depth, with the interpretive understanding that Virtuoso had spent his entire career arguing only came from rigorous classical training. Politicians who couldn't tell a sonata from a symphony found themselves moved. Professional musicians in the audience, people who spent their careers evaluating exactly this kind of performance, sat with wide eyes. Sarah Kennedy, up in the balcony, had tears running down her face. She knew better than almost anyone in that room exactly what she was witnessing. This wasn't competent. This wasn't impressive for a pop star. This was genuinely extraordinary. As the piece built toward its final section, Michael's intensity grew with it. The music demands complete commitment at the end, technically and emotionally, and he gave it everything. His fingers were moving at a speed that seemed impossible until you remember 14 years of daily practice. The final measures thundered through the hall. And then the last chord. And then silence. 28 seconds, by some accounts, of 2,000 people sitting completely still. And then Margaret Sterling, Virtuoso's own colleague, the renowned violinist who had been standing near him at the reception when he'd whispered his contempt for Michael, stood up. She was the first to applaud. And then the room followed her, and it didn't stop. The Kennedy Center, Washington, D.C., December 1983, gave Michael Jackson a standing ovation for Beethoven. Michael stood up from the piano and took a bow, no theatrical gestures, no pop star energy, just a musician acknowledging an audience. As the applause continued, Virtuoso crossed the stage toward him. What he said next, multiple witnesses reported, was this: "Mr. Jackson, I owe you an apology. I've heard that piece performed by some of the world's greatest pianists. Your interpretation ranks among the finest I've ever experienced." Michael looked at the older man, and what witnesses described as his response tells you something important about who he actually was. He didn't gloat, he didn't twist the knife, he didn't make the moment about winning. He said, "This isn't about proving anyone wrong. Music doesn't belong to any genre or group of people. It belongs to everyone who loves it enough to dedicate themselves to understanding it." And then Virtuoso did something that took genuine courage for a man of his stature. He went back to the microphone and addressed the audience himself. He said he had challenged Michael Jackson because he believed popular musicians lacked the training and dedication required for classical music. He said he was wrong, completely and utterly wrong. He said what the audience had just witnessed was not just technical mastery but true artistic understanding, and that Michael Jackson had reminded him that music is not about exclusion or superiority. It's about expression, emotion, and the human spirit. He turned to Michael and said he would be honored to call him a fellow musician. 2,000 people applauded again, but this time it wasn't just for the performance. It was for something rarer, a genuinely powerful man publicly admitting he had been wrong. After the gala, Michael found Sarah Kennedy in the lobby. She was still a little overwhelmed by everything she'd witnessed, the challenge, the performance, the reversal. He thanked her for speaking up. She said she'd just been telling the truth. And then Michael told her something that stuck. He said he'd been thinking about starting a foundation to help young classical musicians from underprivileged backgrounds get access to formal training. And he asked her if she'd be interested in helping develop the program. Sarah Kennedy, Juilliard piano performance student, said yes. That conversation became the Michael Jackson Classical Music Education Foundation. Over the following decade, the foundation provided scholarships and instruments to hundreds of young classical musicians who couldn't otherwise afford formal training. Students who might never have got to a conservatory, who might never have been handed a real instrument, who might have spent their whole lives with a talent nobody could afford to develop. Sarah Kennedy didn't just volunteer for that foundation. She went on to earn her doctorate in music education and became one of the most respected music educators in the country. She was the foundation's first program director. In her office at Juilliard, there's a photograph from that December night. Michael at the piano, completely absorbed, and Virtuoso standing at the side of the stage looking at him with pure amazement. Below the photograph is a handwritten note from Michael, sent to Sarah a few days after they first met. Thank you for reminding me that standing up for what's right is always the right thing to do, regardless of the consequences. Your courage inspired me to show a part of myself I'd kept hidden for too long. Keep making beautiful music. Michael. Here's something I find genuinely remarkable about this story. Alejandro Virtuoso didn't just apologize and go back to his life unchanged. That night actually transformed him. The man who had whispered contempt about Michael Jackson at a reception went on to become an advocate for breaking down the walls between classical and popular music. He started incorporating popular music elements into his teaching. He encouraged his students to explore different genres, to stop treating classical music as a fortress to be protected, and start treating it as a living tradition that could breathe and grow and connect with the world around it. 3 months after the Kennedy Center encounter, Virtuoso did something that was genuinely unprecedented in his world. He invited Michael Jackson to perform a classical pop crossover piece with the National Symphony Orchestra. The performance, which featured Michael playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with his own vocal interpretations woven throughout, became one of the most talked-about musical events of 1984. Two worlds that had never acknowledged each other, performing together on the same stage as equal partners. Years later, when people asked Virtuoso about that night, he said something that I think is worth sitting with. Meeting Michael Jackson was the moment that made me a complete musician. He taught me that being a master of your craft isn't enough. You also have to be master of your prejudices. That's a remarkable thing for a man of his stature to say, and I think it's a remarkable thing for any of us to hear. I keep coming back to this question: why did he keep it hidden for so long? 14 years is a long time to carry a secret, especially one that would have generated so much respect and admiration if it had come out. If Michael Jackson had said in a 1978 interview, "By the way, I've been studying classical piano for almost a decade," the reaction would have been extraordinary. His credibility as an artist would have deepened overnight. So why didn't he? Part of it, as I mentioned, was image management. Motown had a very specific template for who the Jackson 5 were and what they represented. Classical music didn't fit, and by the time Michael was making his own decisions about his public image, the pop star persona was so enormous and so established that any deviation from it risked confusing the audience. But I think there's something deeper here. Michael Jackson talked about music in a way that very few entertainers do. He talked about it as a sacred thing, a spiritual thing, something that existed on a plane above commercial concerns and image management and charts and sales. In a 1983 interview, he said something that I think explains a lot. "When I sit down to play, I disappear. I'm not Michael Jackson anymore. I'm just someone listening to the music come through." The classical piano practice was, I think, the purest expression of that. It was the part of his musical life that existed entirely outside the machine. Nobody was filming it. Nobody was going to sell it. There was no audience to impress, no chart position to chase, no expectation to meet. It was just him and the music. When you frame it that way, keeping it private makes complete sense. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because he was protective of it. It was his. And the moment it became public, it would no longer be entirely his. It would be packaged and marketed and turned into a story, just like everything else about him. That December night, he made the choice to share it. Not for his career, not for his image. Because he was standing in a room where someone was using his music, or rather, their perception of his music, to diminish him. And he chose to respond not with words, but with the most honest thing he had. There's something deeply moving about that to me. This story is about Michael Jackson, but it's also about something bigger. Musical prejudice is real, and it's been around for as long as there have been multiple kinds of music. There's always been a version of the conversation Virtuoso started that night. Some genres are considered serious, and some are considered entertainment. Some musicians are considered artists, and some are considered performers. The people making those distinctions usually have a lot invested in where the line gets drawn. And what's interesting is that the people being dismissed by those distinctions often have far more depth than the dismissers ever looked for. Michael Jackson is an extreme example, but the pattern repeats itself constantly. Jazz musicians who were told their music wasn't serious until jazz became the thing that classical musicians looked down on from. Rock and roll musicians who were told they were corrupting youth until rock became the establishment that punk was rebelling against. Hip-hop artists who spent decades being told they weren't making real music until hip-hop became the dominant musical form of the century. The gatekeeping never goes away, it just finds new targets. What Virtuoso learned that night, what he had the decency to actually absorb and change because of, is that the gatekeeper's job is not to protect music. Music doesn't need protecting. The gatekeeper's job is to protect the gatekeeper's sense of superiority. And the moment you realize that, the gate stops looking like a gate and starts looking like what it always was, a wall that serves no one. Michael Jackson walked through that wall with Beethoven, and Virtuoso, to his credit, helped tear it down. Music historians who have looked back at that period point to the Kennedy Center performance as part of a broader shift in how the industry began to think about crossover artists. The idea that a musician could be genuinely excellent in multiple genres simultaneously, that pop and classical weren't opposing forces but different expressions of the same human impulse, started to gain traction in ways it hadn't before. It didn't happen overnight. These things never do, but that night planted a seed. And the ripple effects extended in directions nobody predicted. Virtuoso's shift toward musical inclusion influenced his students, who went on to influence their students. The Michael Jackson Classical Music Education Foundation touched hundreds of lives directly and countless more indirectly through the educators those students became. Sarah Kennedy's career in music education has shaped the way a generation of young musicians in this country thinks about genre, about access, and about who music belongs to. The Steinway grand piano that Michael played that night still sits on the Kennedy Center stage, if you can believe it. Piano technicians who service it have occasionally mentioned, and I realize this might sound sentimental, but stay with me, that it seems to have a particular resonance. Something in the wood, in the way the strings respond, as if one extraordinary night left something behind in the instrument itself. I don't know if I believe that literally, but I understand why people say it. Some performances do something to a room, they change the air, and sometimes that change doesn't fully go away. Michael never gave a detailed public account of what happened that night. It wasn't his style. He didn't seek vindication through interviews. He didn't write about it extensively or turn it into a promotional moment. But in later years, in various interviews, he would occasionally say things that seemed to circle around it without nomming it directly. He said people like to put music in boxes, but music doesn't live in boxes. It lives in hearts. Whether it's classical, pop, rock, or jazz, if it touches someone's soul, it's doing its job. He said, I've always believed that the greatest musicians are the ones who never stop being students. The moment you think you've arrived, you stop growing. He said, the best thing music education ever gave me wasn't technique. It was humility, the ability to sit down in front of something beautiful and understand how much I still had to learn. When you know what you know about that December night, those words land differently. He wasn't just talking philosophically. He was talking from experience, from 14 years of secret practice, from the moment he chose to stop hiding, from the look on Virtuoso's face when the last chord of the Moonlight Sonata faded into the Kennedy Center air. He was a man who understood music on multiple levels simultaneously, who had chosen to show the world only one of them for most of his career, and who finally, in one unrepeatable moment, let everything show. I want to take a step back here because I think this story risks becoming just a feel-good underdog narrative if we're not careful. Michael Jackson proving his classical piano skills is a great story, but the thing it actually reveals is something more complex and more interesting than just pop star surprises snobs with Beethoven. What it reveals is that Michael Jackson's artistry ran deeper than almost anyone knew. Think about the way he talked about music throughout his career. Think about the complexity of his compositions, the way Thriller builds and layers, the way he thought about rhythm and texture and counterpoint in his arrangements, the way he worked with Quincy Jones to create productions that were simultaneously commercially irresistible and musically sophisticated in ways that didn't announce themselves. His musical intelligence was always there. The classical training didn't create it, it fed it. It gave him a vocabulary and a framework that he then applied across everything else he did. When people who have studied music deeply listen to Michael Jackson's catalog with that context in mind, They hear things they didn't hear before. The structural sophistication, the harmonic awareness, the sense of how tension builds and releases in a way that goes far beyond what most pop producers think about. He knew what he was doing. He always knew what he was doing. The classical training wasn't separate from the pop career. It was underneath it, holding it up, giving it a foundation that most people never knew was there. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, and I keep coming back to a few things that I think are worth saying out loud. The first is about assumptions. Virtuoso looked at Michael Jackson and thought he knew what he was looking at. He saw the sequined glove and the Thriller album, and he drew a conclusion so complete that he was willing to humiliate a man in public based on it. And he was wrong, not just a little wrong. Fundamentally, thoroughly, embarrassingly wrong. How often do we do a version of that? Not on a stage in front of 2,000 people, but in smaller, quieter ways. We see someone and decide we know what they are. We hear what genre they work in, what school they went to, what neighborhood they come from, what they look like, and we draw a box around them and assume the box is complete. It's never complete. The second thing is about hiding versus protecting. Michael spent 14 years protecting something precious from a world that he knew would commercialize it the moment it became public. There's something to be said for that. Not everything needs to be shared. Not every gift needs to be performed. There's value in having something that's just yours, that exists for its own sake and not for anyone else's. At the same time, and this is the tension in the story, there are moments when the right thing to do is let it show. When keeping something hidden becomes a kind of dishonesty. When someone is trying to erase a part of you, the truest response is to make that part visible. Michael chose the right moment, and when he made that choice, he did it completely. And the third thing is about what it actually takes to build a skill. 14 years, daily practice. Private, unglamorous, no audience, no applause. Just a person and a piano and a commitment to getting better. In a world that loves overnight success stories and viral moments, and the idea that talent is something you either have or don't, Michael Jackson quietly put in 14 years of work on something nobody even knew he was doing. That's not glamorous. That's not the kind of thing that makes headlines, but it's the kind of thing that makes the headline moment possible. That December night at the Kennedy Center in 1983 was a lot of things. It was a public challenge that went spectacularly wrong for the person who issued it. It was a revelation about an artist who had hidden a major part of himself for over a decade. It was the moment a 68-year-old classical piano legend had his worldview cracked open and rebuilt in the span of 8 minutes. It was a Juilliard student who stood up in a balcony and told the truth when it would have been much easier to stay seated. It was a handwritten note sent a few days later, a foundation that funded hundreds of scholarships, a photograph on an office wall at a music school in New York City. It was Beethoven, played by Michael Jackson, in a room full of people who were absolutely certain they knew what they were about to hear. And then they heard something else entirely. The piano that Michael played that night is still there. If you ever find yourself in the Kennedy Center Concert Hall, you'll be in the same room where one of the most extraordinary moments in modern music history took place. A moment that most people outside that room never knew happened. Until now, music doesn't live in boxes, it lives in hearts. Michael Jackson proved that at 31 years old with Beethoven, in front of 2,000 people, on a stage where he was never supposed to belong. All right, if you made it this far, genuinely thank you. This is one of those stories I couldn't stop thinking about after I found it, and I hope it hit you the same way. If you want to keep going down this rabbit hole, I've got a video coming up about the other musicians who kept major hidden talents secret from the public. Some of the names on that list are going to absolutely stun you. Subscribe so you don't miss it when it drops. And leave me a comment right now, I genuinely read them. Tell me, what's the most surprising thing you learned about Michael Jackson from this video? Or if you already knew about his classical training, tell me how you found out, because I have a feeling that's a story in itself. Share this one with someone who thinks they know everything about Michael Jackson, because they don't. I'll see you in the next one.